They told me working night shift at the abandoned shopping mall would be easy money. Just walk the perimeter, check the doors, make sure nobody breaks in. What they didn't mention was why the previous 4 security guards quit without giving notice. What they didn't tell me was about the stores that stay open after midnight, even though the mall officially closed 3 years ago. If you enjoy stories about places that operate by different rules than the rest of the world, you might want to subscribe. But let's start with what I discovered on my first night. I needed the work. My divorce finalized 8 weeks ago, and Rebecca kept the house. Fair enough, she'd been making the payments while I bounced between temp jobs and unemployment checks. But it left me in a studio apartment above a laundromat in Riverside, paying twice what the place was worth because my credit had taken hits I couldn't explain to a landlord. The divorce attorney's final bill sat on my kitchen counter like a threat. $3,400 I didn't have, for services that felt more like supervised failure than legal representation. So when Mike Torino called about a security position, I said yes before he finished the job description. Mike and I went way back. High school, different paths after graduation, but he'd always been the guy who knew about opportunities before they got posted anywhere official. He managed facilities for some property development company, handled the weird jobs that didn't quite fit normal categories. Private security, maintenance contracts, the kind of work that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about employment gaps. "It's Crosswinds Mall," he said when we met at the diner on Magnolia. "You remember that place, right? Off the 60, near the old Sears distribution center." I remembered. Big complex, 3 stories, built sometime in the 80s when the area was supposed to become the next major suburban hub. It worked for maybe 15 years. Then the newer mall opened closer to the freeway, and the anchor stores started moving. By 2010, it was mostly empty. By 2018, it was completely closed. "Thought that place got demolished," I said. Mike shook his head. "Scheduled for demolition. But there's some legal thing with the property ownership. Corporate bankruptcy, liens, something complicated. So it just sits there while lawyers figure it out. Meanwhile, kids keep breaking in. Homeless people try to set up camps in the old department stores. Insurance company wants overnight security until the whole thing gets resolved." The job was simple. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. Walk the building, check for break-ins, document anything unusual. $500 a week, paid in cash. No benefits, no paperwork, no background checks. Just show up and make sure the empty building stayed empty. "What happened to the last guy?" I asked. Mike looked uncomfortable. "4 guys, actually. None of them lasted more than a couple weeks." "Why?" "They said the place felt weird at night. Too quiet, too. I don't know. Active for an empty building. One guy said he heard music playing from stores that didn't have power." I almost laughed. "Music? Look, David, I'm not saying I believe any of that. But the job pays, it's easy work, and you need income. You interested or not?" I was interested. Ghosts don't pay rent, but $500 a week would cover my apartment and leave enough for groceries. I told Mike yes. He handed me a set of keys and a flashlight that felt heavier than it looked. Good quality, the kind that costs $60 or $70 new. "There are some rules," Mike said. "Company policy." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, the kind that had been photocopied too many times. The text was slightly fuzzy, but readable. Rule 1. Never enter any store that has its gate or security door closed, even if you hear sounds from inside, especially if you hear sounds from inside. Rule 2. If you encounter other people in the building, verify they have legitimate business there. Security, maintenance, property management. Anyone else needs to leave immediately. Rule 3. Document everything in the log book. Times, locations, observations. Be specific. Rule 4. If any of the directory signs show store listings that weren't there during your previous rounds, do not investigate. Make a note and continue your route. Rule 5. The food court area is off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. Do not enter that section of the building during those hours. Rule 6. If you find any doors or entrances that you don't remember from your initial walkthrough, do not go through them. Mark their location and report them at the end of your shift. Rule 7. Mall security office is located on the second floor, near what used to be the GameStop. There's a desk, a chair, some basic supplies. That's your base. Stay there when you're not walking rounds. I read through the list again. These seem specific. Insurance requirements, Mike said quickly. Legal liability stuff. You know how corporations are about covering their asses. What about the power? Is there electricity? Emergency lighting only. Enough to see where you're going. The main power grid was disconnected when the mall closed, but the security systems still run on backup power. Mike stood up, left a 10 on the table for coffee he'd barely touched. You start tomorrow night, 10 p.m. sharp. Security office is unlocked. Key works on all the exterior doors. Any questions? I had a dozen questions, but Mike was already walking toward his car. I watched him drive away, then looked at the rules again. They read like warnings disguised as policy, but 500 a week was 500 a week. The next evening, I drove out to Crosswinds Mall at 9:30. The parking lot stretched out like a concrete ocean, weeds growing through cracks in the asphalt. A few street lights still worked, throwing yellow circles of light that made the emptiness feel bigger. The main entrance was secured with metal sheets, but Mike had told me to use the service entrance near the old Macy's. The service door opened easily. Inside, emergency lighting cast everything in dim red. I could see the basic outline of the main corridor, storefronts on both sides, most of them sealed with metal security gates. The air smelled stale, like dust, and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet, but artificial. I found the security office without trouble. Second floor, exactly where Mike said it would be. Small room with a metal desk, a chair that squeaked when I sat down, and a logbook that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The last entry was dated 6 weeks ago, just 2 lines, completed rounds. Nothing unusual to report. The handwriting looked hurried. I decided to do my first walkthrough, get familiar with the layout. The main corridor ran the length of the building, with smaller corridors branching off toward department stores and specialty shops. Most of the storefronts were dark, their security gates locked in place. But as I walked, I started noticing things that seemed off. Some of the stores had lights on inside. Not bright lights, just a faint glow behind the security gates. I counted 4 of them on the first floor alone. According to Rule 1, I wasn't supposed to enter any store that had its security door closed. But the rules didn't say anything about stores with lights. I made a note in my mental catalog. Store lights, first floor, possible electrical issue. The second floor was quieter. Fewer stores, more open space where the old department store anchors used to be. I found what had been a children's play area, plastic climbing structures still bolted to the floor but covered in dust. Beyond that, a section that had been clothing stores, all empty now except for a few forgotten hangers. Third floor was mostly empty space. Storage areas, employee break rooms, the kind of back office infrastructure that customers never saw. The emergency lighting was dimmer here, just enough to keep me from walking into walls. I was about to head back to the security office when I heard it. Music. Faint, but definitely music. Coming from somewhere below me. I stood still, listening. It was instrumental, the kind of background music you'd hear in a department store. Orchestral, pleasant, completely normal except for the fact that it was playing in an abandoned building at 11:45 at night. I followed the sound downstairs, trying to pinpoint its source. The music seemed to be coming from the first floor, somewhere near the old Spencer's location. But as I got closer, it faded. By the time I reached the storefront, I couldn't hear it anymore. I made another mental note. Possible audio system malfunction. First floor, 11:45 p.m. Back in the security office, I wrote my first official log entry. Initial walkthrough completed. Observed lights in several closed storefronts. Possible electrical maintenance needed. Heard background music, source unclear. Building secure. I spent the rest of the night walking rounds every 2 hours, checking doors, looking for anything that seemed out of place. The building felt strange, but not dangerous. Just empty in a way that wasn't quite empty. Like walking through a house where everyone had gone to bed, but you could still sense their presence. By 6 a.m., nothing else unusual had happened. I locked up, drove home, and slept until 3 in the afternoon. Have you ever been in a place that felt like it was holding its breath? That felt occupied even though you knew it was empty? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. The second night started the same way. I arrived at 9:30, checked in at the security office, began my first round at 10:15. But this time, I noticed something different. The store directory near the main entrance had changed. Not dramatically, but I was sure I remembered seeing empty slots where store names used to be displayed. Now some of those slots had names in them. Meridian Books, Timeless Gifts, Northbound Travel, stores I didn't remember from my first night. I checked Rule 4. If any of the directory signs show store listings that weren't there during your previous rounds, do not investigate. Make a note and continue your route. I made the note, but I couldn't help looking for these stores as I walked. Meridian Books was supposed to be located on the second floor, near where the old Radio Shack used to be. When I got there, I found a storefront that looked different than I remembered. The security gate was down, but there was definitely light coming from inside. Not electric light, warmer than that, like candlelight or oil lamps. I stood outside the gate for a minute, listening. I could hear pages turning, the soft rustle of paper, like someone browsing through books. But Rule 1 was clear. Never enter any store that has its gate or security door closed, especially if you hear sounds from inside. I moved on. Timeless Gifts was listed as first floor, west corridor. I found it exactly where the directory said it would be. Another gate-covered storefront, another warm glow from inside. This time I heard different sounds. Footsteps. Someone walking around inside the store, maybe moving inventory, maybe just browsing. I checked my watch. 11:30 p.m. According to the rules, if I encountered other people in the building, I was supposed to verify they had legitimate business there. Security, maintenance, property management. But the people I was hearing were behind locked security gates, in stores that were supposed to be empty. I made notes in the logbook when I got back to the office. Directory shows new store listings. Stores appear to be occupied, unable to verify legitimacy per rule restrictions. Around 12:15, I decided to test something. I walked back to Meridian Books, stood outside the security gate, and called out, "Hello? This is building security. Can you hear me?" The page turning stopped. For about 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Then I heard footsteps approaching the front of the store. Someone was walking toward the security gate from inside. "We're closed," a voice said. Male, middle-aged, matter of fact. "Sir, I need to verify that you have authorization to be in this building." "I have a lease," the voice replied. "Store hours are 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. We're open for business." I looked at the security gate. It was definitely locked. The store was definitely supposed to be empty. But I was having a conversation with someone who claimed to have a lease and business hours that matched my security shift exactly. "Can you show me your documentation?" I asked. "Do you have authorization to enter the store?" I didn't. Rule 1 specifically prohibited entering stores with closed security doors. I was in a weird bureaucratic loop. The person inside claimed to be legitimate, but I couldn't verify their legitimacy without violating the rules I'd been given. "I'll need to report this," I said. "Of course," the voice replied. "Have a good evening." I heard footsteps walking away from the gate. Then the sound of pages turning resumed. I went back to the security office and called Mike Torino. It went straight to voicemail, which wasn't surprising at 12:30 in the morning. I left a message explaining the situation, then continued my rounds. The rest of the night was quiet, except for the ongoing activity in the stores with lights. I counted 6 of them total. Books, gifts, travel agency, a place called Crossroads Diner, something called Midnight Electronics, and a shop with no visible name but the sound of fabric being cut and sewn. All of them seemed to be doing business. All of them had security gates that were locked from the outside. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I noticed something else. The parking lot wasn't completely empty anymore. There were maybe 8 or 10 cars scattered around the main entrance, all of them parked in spaces that had been empty when I arrived. I wrote everything in the logbook, locked up, and drove home. Mike called me back around noon. "David, I got your message. Look, there's some stuff about this job that's complicated." "What kind of complicated?" "The stores you're seeing, they're legitimate. Sort of. The mall never completely closed," Mike said. "Some of the businesses negotiated special lease terms. They operate on reduced hours, limited access, cash-only transactions. It's all legal, but it's not exactly public knowledge." "Why not?" "Because the demographics are unusual. Night shift workers, insomniacs, people who prefer to shop when there aren't crowds. It's a niche market, but it's profitable enough to keep some stores running even after the main mall operations shut down." "So the people I heard, they're real customers?" "They're real customers. And the store employees are real employees. They just work different hours than most retail." I thought about this. It explained the voices, the activity, the cars in the parking lot. But it raised other questions. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because most security guards find it distracting. They start focusing on the store activity instead of actual security issues. Break-ins, vandalism, that kind of thing. And the rules. The rules are there to keep you focused on your job. Building security, not retail supervision. These businesses have their own security, their own management, their own insurance. Your job is to secure the common areas and make sure nobody unauthorized gets into the building." This made sense, sort of, but I still had questions. What about Rule 5? The food court being off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. Mike paused. "That's when they do cleaning and maintenance in that section. Industrial equipment, chemical cleaning supplies, insurance liability thing. It's easier to restrict access than it is to ensure safety protocols are followed." And Rule 6? Doors and entrances I don't remember? The building's been modified several times over the years. Some entrances get sealed, some get reopened. Depends on lease requirements and fire safety regulations. If you find an entrance you don't remember, it might be a modification you weren't told about. Rather than have you investigate and potentially interfere with legitimate business operations, it's easier to just have you report it. Mike's explanations covered most of what I'd experienced, but they felt like explanations designed to stop me from asking more questions, rather than explanations that actually answered my questions. If this story is keeping you intrigued, a quick like helps more people discover these unusual places where business operates by different rules. "Look," Mike said, "the job pays well because it's unusual, but it's legitimate work, and the people involved are just trying to make a living. Can you handle that?" I told him I could handle it. My third night, I decided to test the boundaries a little more systematically. I arrived at the usual time, checked in at the security office, then started my rounds with a different attitude. Instead of trying to avoid the occupied stores, I would observe them more carefully and see what I could learn. Meridian Books was active again, lights on, sounds of movement inside. I stood outside the security gate and listened for about 5 minutes. Page turning, Footsteps, occasional voices. Quiet conversation, the kind you'd hear in any bookstore. At one point, I heard someone laugh. A genuine, warm laugh, like someone had found something funny or clever. Timeless gifts had a different kind of activity. I could hear objects being moved around, like someone rearranging inventory. Occasionally, the sound of a cash register. Actual transactions were happening inside these stores. The travel agency, Northbound Travel, had the sound of a television or radio. Weather reports, flight announcements, the kind of background audio you'd expect in a travel office. At one point, I heard someone making a phone call. Professional, businesslike, someone booking a reservation or confirming an itinerary. What struck me most was how normal it all sounded. If I closed my eyes and just listened, it could have been any shopping mall during regular business hours. People browsing, employees working, transactions happening. But there was something else. A pattern I started noticing around 1 a.m. The stores that were active seemed to be serving customers who didn't come through the main entrances. I never saw anyone walking through the common areas of the mall. No foot traffic in the corridors, no people moving between stores. But the businesses inside were clearly serving someone. I decided to test Rule 5. The food court area was off limits between midnight and 3 a.m., supposedly for cleaning and maintenance. But if the other stores were serving customers during those same hours, maybe the food court restriction was more flexible than Mike had indicated. At 1:15 a.m., I walked toward the food court section. It was on the first floor, past the old Spencer's location, in what used to be the central hub of the mall. As I approached, I could smell food cooking. Not cleaning chemicals, not industrial maintenance. Actual food. French fries, coffee, something that smelled like bacon. The entrance to the food court area was blocked by a chain-link barrier, the kind they use for construction zones. But the barrier wasn't locked. It was held in place by a simple clasp, easy to open if you needed access. I stood there for a moment, weighing the rules against my curiosity. Rule 5 said the area was off limits between midnight and 3 a.m. But the rules had been presented as insurance requirements and legal liability measures. If there were legitimate businesses operating in the food court and customers were being served, then the restriction might be more about protecting liability than actual safety. I opened the clasp and stepped through the barrier. The food court looked completely different than I'd expected. Instead of an empty space with scattered tables and closed restaurant stalls, it was fully operational. 3 restaurants were open and serving customers. A burger place called Late Night Grill, a coffee shop called Midnight Roast, and what appeared to be a small diner with no visible name. And there were customers. Maybe 20 people scattered around the tables, eating, drinking coffee, having quiet conversations. All of them looked normal. Office workers, medical scrubs, a few people in retail uniforms. The night shift crowd Mike had mentioned. No one seemed surprised to see me. A few people glanced up when I walked in, but most continued eating or talking. One woman, sitting alone at a table near Midnight Roast, nodded at me like she recognized me. I approached her table. "Excuse me, I'm building security. Can I ask how you got into the mall tonight?" She looked at me like I'd asked a strange question. "Through the food court entrance," she said. "Same way I always come in. The food court has its own entrance. Service entrance, near the loading docks. It's been open since the mall started operating night hours." "Night hours?" 3 years now," she said. "Ever since the day shift operations shut down. A lot of us work nights, needed somewhere to grab a meal or do some shopping. Management kept a few businesses open to serve the night shift community." This was the first I'd heard about a night shift community. Mike had mentioned that some stores negotiated special lease terms, but he'd made it sound like a small number of unusual businesses. This looked like an entire parallel retail operation. "Are you familiar with the building security protocols?" I asked. You mean the rules they give the new guards? She smiled. Yeah, we've seen a few guards come and go. Most of them don't last long once they realize what's actually happening here. What's actually happening here? Night shift retail, she said. Same as day shift retail, just different hours. You work nights, you shop nights. Not that complicated. But the security rules say. The security rules are designed to keep day shift thinking and night shift operations separate, she said. A lot of people get uncomfortable when they find out about businesses that operate primarily between midnight and 6 a.m. They start imagining things that aren't there. She finished her coffee, stood up. You seem all right, though. Most guards either freak out and quit, or they start trying to shut everything down. You're just asking questions. What happened to the guards who tried to shut everything down? Nothing dramatic, she said. They'd file reports, call their supervisors, demand explanations. Then they'd get reassigned to different properties. Night shift retail isn't for everyone, but it's legitimate business, same as any other retail operation. She started walking toward what I assumed was the food court entrance she'd mentioned. You want some advice? Do your job, follow the rules, don't overthink it. People here just want to eat, shop, and get home before sunrise. Same as anyone else. I watched her leave, then looked around the food court again. Everything seemed genuinely normal. People finishing meals, cleaning up their tables, a few still ordering food from the restaurants. The staff looked like typical food service workers. Young, professional, focused on doing their jobs. I walked over to Late Night Grill and approached the counter. The employee looked up from a grill where several burgers were cooking. You're the new security guy, he said. It wasn't a question. David, I said. I'm trying to understand how this all works. Pretty simple, he said, flipping a burger. We serve food. People buy food. Same as any restaurant, just different hours. How long have you been operating these hours? I've been here about 6 months. But the restaurant's been running night shift for maybe 2 years. Good business. Good enough, he said. Night shift workers need places to eat. Not many restaurants are open between midnight and 6 a.m., so we stay pretty busy. He handed a completed order to another customer, then turned back to me. You have questions about the rules? Some of the rules seem designed to keep me away from the businesses that are actually operating. That's because the last few guards got obsessive. They'd spend their shifts questioning customers, demanding to see receipts, trying to verify everyone's employment status. Turned into harassment pretty quick. So the rules are about customer service, not safety. Customer service and liability, he said. You start hassling customers, they stop coming. Business suffers, leases don't get renewed, whole operation falls apart. This made more sense than the explanations Mike had given me. The rules weren't about supernatural activity or insurance requirements. They were about keeping security personnel focused on security issues instead of retail management. What about Rule 6? Doors and entrances I don't remember? Different businesses have different access needs, he said. Some customers prefer more discreet entrances. Some delivery schedules work better with modified loading arrangements. Building management opens and closes entrances based on tenant requirements. And the directory changes? New businesses, closed businesses. Same as any mall, just faster turnover because the market's smaller. I thanked him and walked back toward the security office, processing what I'd learned. The night shift retail operation was legitimate, well organized, and much larger than Mike had indicated. The rules I'd been given were designed to maintain separation between security operations and business operations, not to protect me from anything dangerous or supernatural. But that raised new questions. Why had the previous 4 guards quit? If this was just retail with unusual hours, what had made them uncomfortable enough to leave without notice? If you're finding this exploration of places that operate by different rules fascinating, subscribing means you won't miss what I discovered next. I spent the rest of my shift walking regular rounds, but with a different perspective. Instead of avoiding the active stores, I listened more carefully to what was happening inside them. Customer service interactions, business transactions, normal retail operations. I could hear employees helping customers, people making purchases, the everyday sounds of commerce. Around 4 a.m., I noticed something new. Some of the stores that had been active earlier were starting to close. Lights dimming, sounds of equipment being shut down, employees cleaning up and preparing to leave. By 5 a.m., most of the activity had stopped. By 6 a.m., when my shift ended, the building felt genuinely empty again. I made detailed notes in the logbook. Night shift retail operations observed in food court and multiple storefronts. Customers access building through alternative entrances. Businesses operate approximately 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. All activity appears legitimate and well-organized. When I got home, I called Mike again. I visited the food court last night. I said, "It's not closed for cleaning and maintenance. There are restaurants operating, serving customers." Mike was quiet for a long moment. "David, I told you the rules were there for a reason. The rules are there to keep security separate from retail operations. That's different than what you told me before." "What I told you before was true," Mike said. "Some of it. Look, the night shift retail operation is legitimate, but it's complicated. The businesses pay rent, they have proper licenses, everything's legal. But the clientele is unusual." "Unusual how?" "People who work night shifts tend to be different than day shift workers. Different schedules, different lifestyles, different social patterns. Some of them prefer to do business at hours when they won't encounter traditional retail crowds." "That doesn't sound unusual. That sounds practical." "It is practical," Mike said, "but it's also profitable in ways that make day shift property management uncomfortable. Night shift retail margins are higher, customer loyalty is stronger, and there's less competition. Some of the businesses operating in that mall are making more money per square foot than comparable day shift operations. So what's the problem?" "The problem is that successful night shift retail starts attracting attention from day shift retail. Property management companies, chain stores, corporate headquarters. They start wanting to understand how the model works, whether it can be replicated, whether they can capture that market share. And that's bad because night shift retail works specifically because it operates outside traditional retail structures," Mike said. "The moment it becomes part of traditional retail, it stops working. The customers go somewhere else. The businesses fail. Everyone loses money." Mike explained that the security rules were designed to maintain what he called operational separation. Night shift businesses could operate successfully as long as they remained invisible to day shift business analysis. The moment security guards started documenting customer patterns, business hours, revenue streams, or operational procedures, that information could end up in corporate reports that would fundamentally change how the night shift operation functioned. "Your job is to secure the building," Mike said. "Physical security, break-ins, vandalism, emergency situations. But the less documentation there is about the specific businesses and their operations, the better it is for everyone involved." "Including me?" "Including you. These businesses generate enough revenue to keep the building operational and profitable. That means steady security work for as long as you want it. But if corporate attention kills the night shift operation, the building goes back to being genuinely empty, and there's no need for security." This explanation made sense, but it also made me realize how much I didn't understand about what I'd gotten myself into. Night shift retail that was more profitable than day shift retail, businesses that needed to remain invisible to succeed, customers who preferred to shop in abandoned shopping malls rather than traditional stores. "What happened to the previous guards?" "They got too curious," Mike said. "Started asking questions, demanding explanations, trying to understand things that were outside their job description. Eventually, they either got uncomfortable and quit, or they got too involved and had to be reassigned. Too involved how? Started shopping there themselves. Started socializing with customers and employees. Started thinking of themselves as part of the night shift community instead of building security. When that happens, they stop being effective security guards. Is that a problem? It can be, Mike said, because night shift retail attracts some customers who specifically need to avoid traditional retail environments. People with unusual work schedules, people who prefer anonymity, people who have reasons to avoid crowds or conventional shopping hours. Nothing illegal, but privacy-focused. Security guards who get too friendly with customers can compromise that privacy. I spent my fourth night trying to maintain better boundaries. I walked my rounds, checked doors and exits, documented security issues. When I heard activity from the occupied stores, I noted it briefly and moved on. I didn't try to engage with customers or employees, didn't ask questions about business operations, didn't visit the food court. But maintaining boundaries didn't stop me from noticing things. The customers I occasionally glimpsed were more diverse than I'd initially realized. Not just night shift workers, but people of different ages, backgrounds, and apparent professions. I saw someone in a nurse's uniform, someone who looked like a college professor, a few people in business suits, someone in what appeared to be a chef's uniform. The businesses themselves seemed more specialized than typical mall retail. Meridian Books appeared to focus on rare or unusual books, based on the conversations I could overhear. Timeless Gifts seemed to carry antiques and collectibles. Northbound Travel appeared to specialize in unconventional destinations and travel arrangements. And there were sounds that suggested services beyond simple retail. From Midnight Electronics, I could hear what sounded like repair work being performed. Technical conversations, testing equipment, diagnostic procedures. From the unnamed shop where I'd heard fabric being cut, there were sounds of custom tailoring or alterations. This wasn't just night shift retail. This was night shift specialty retail, serving customers with specific needs that couldn't be met through traditional shopping. On my fifth night, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the whole operation. I was doing my regular rounds around 2 a.m. when I noticed a new entrance I hadn't seen before. Not a door or exit, but a stairway leading down from the main corridor. It was located between two closed storefronts, in a section of the building where I was sure there had been solid wall during my previous rounds. According to Rule 6, if I found any doors or entrances that I didn't remember from my initial walkthrough, I should not go through them, but should mark their location and report them at the end of my shift. But I was starting to understand that the rules were less about safety and more about maintaining operational separation. And my curiosity was stronger than my caution. I descended the stairway. It led to a lower level that wasn't shown on any of the building directories I'd seen. A basement level, or maybe a sub-basement, with corridors that extended in directions that didn't match the layout of the floors above. The lighting down here was different. Not emergency lighting, but actual electric illumination. Soft, warm, like residential lighting rather than commercial lighting. And there were people. Not customers browsing in retail stores, but people who appeared to live here. I saw someone carrying laundry, someone cooking food in what looked like a small kitchen, someone reading in what appeared to be a living room. This wasn't night shift retail. This was residential space. People were actually living in the abandoned shopping mall. Have you ever discovered that a place you thought you understood was something completely different? What would you do if you found people living somewhere they weren't supposed to be? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I walked carefully through the lower level, trying to understand what I was seeing. The residential spaces were well organized and comfortable. Not makeshift camps or temporary shelters, but actual living arrangements. Furnished apartments, common areas, what appeared to be a small library. I encountered an elderly man in one of the common areas, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. "You're the new security guard," he said. Like the woman in the food court, it wasn't a question. "I'm David. I didn't know anyone was living down here." "Been here about 4 years," he said. "Since the mall transitioned to night operations." "Is this legal?" "Legal enough," he said. "We pay rent. We maintain the spaces. We don't cause problems. Property management prefers tenants who are quiet and self-sufficient." "How many people live here?" "Changes depending on the season and people's circumstances," he said. "Right now, maybe 30 or 40 people." "What kind of people?" "Night shift workers, mostly. People who work hours that make traditional housing arrangements difficult. Medical personnel, security guards, overnight maintenance workers, truck drivers, people in 24-hour service industries." He explained that traditional apartments and rental housing were designed around day shift schedules. Lease requirements, noise ordinances, building management policies, community standards, all of it assumed that residents would sleep at night and be active during the day. "When you work midnight to 8 a.m., traditional housing doesn't work," he said. "You need quiet during the day when everyone else is active. You need access to services during hours when most businesses are closed. You need neighbors who understand that your lifestyle is different. So you live in a shopping mall. We live in a residential community that happens to be located in a building that used to be a shopping mall," he said. "The retail spaces upstairs serve our commercial needs. The residential spaces down here serve our housing needs. It's a self-contained community designed around night shift schedules." This was larger and more complex than anything Mike had explained. Not just night shift retail, but an entire night shift community. Residential, commercial, and service operations all organized around people who worked unconventional hours. "What about the security rules? Why are guards told to avoid certain areas?" "Because most security guards are day shift people," he said. "They see residential space in a commercial building and assume something's wrong. They see retail operations during hours when most businesses are closed and assume something's illegal. They see people living lifestyles that are different than traditional lifestyles and assume something's dangerous. So the rules are about protecting the community from security guards, not protecting security guards from the community. The rules are about maintaining separation until security guards understand what they're actually securing," he said. "Most guards quit before they get to this conversation. The ones who stay usually become part of the community eventually." "Part of the community?" "David, you work security from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. When do you sleep? When do you shop? When do you socialize? When do you handle personal business?" I thought about this. Since taking the job, my schedule had become increasingly isolated from traditional daytime activities. I slept during the day while most people were at work. I was awake during hours when most businesses were closed. My social interactions were limited to brief conversations with convenience store clerks and all-night diner staff. The divorce had already isolated me from most of my previous social connections, and the night shift work was making it difficult to form new ones. "You're already living on night shift time," he said. "The question is whether you want to be isolated on night shift time or part of a community on night shift time." I looked around the residential level again. It was clean, well-maintained, and genuinely comfortable. More comfortable than my studio apartment above the laundromat, and probably more affordable. The people I'd seen seemed relaxed and content, like they'd found a living arrangement that actually worked for their lifestyles. How does someone become part of this community? Usually, they start by doing their security job well, he said. Building trust, demonstrating that they understand the difference between security issues and lifestyle differences. Then, if they're interested, they talk to community management about residential options. Community management? Margaret Torres. She's been organizing night shift housing for about 6 years. Used to work hospital administration, understands the challenges of non-traditional work schedules. She's the one who negotiated the residential lease arrangements with the property company. And the property company is okay with people living in a shopping mall. The property company is okay with tenants who pay rent, maintain their spaces, and don't create legal problems, he said. Commercial residential leases are unusual, but they're not illegal, especially when the alternative is an empty building that generates no income. He gave me Margaret's contact information and suggested I finish my security rounds before talking to her. She's usually available around 4 a.m., he said. That's when most community business gets handled. I went back upstairs and completed my regular walkthrough, but my perspective on everything had changed again. The night shift retail operation wasn't just serving customers with unusual schedules. It was serving residents with unusual lifestyles. The stores I'd been observing were providing commercial services to a residential community that existed entirely outside traditional day shift society. At 4 a.m., I went back to the residential level and found Margaret Torres in what appeared to be a small office near the community library. She was reviewing paperwork that looked like lease agreements and maintenance schedules. "David," she said when I knocked on her door, "I heard you might stop by." Margaret was probably in her 50s, with the calm competence of someone who'd spent years managing complex operations. Her office was organized and professional, like any property management office, just located in the basement of an abandoned shopping mall. "I'm trying to understand how all of this works," I said. "It works because we've organized it to work," she said. "Night shift workers have the same housing needs as day shift workers. Privacy, security, access to commercial services, community connections, affordable rent. The difference is that traditional housing markets don't serve night shift schedules very well." Margaret explained that night shift workers faced systematic challenges in traditional housing. Lease applications that required day shift employment verification. Noise complaints from day shift neighbors who didn't understand that someone coming home from work at 7 a.m. might need to do laundry or cook breakfast. Community policies that assumed residents would be quiet during evening hours and active during morning hours. Commercial residential leases solve most of these problems, she said. "We lease residential space the same way businesses lease commercial space, based on rental income and responsible tenancy, not employment schedules or lifestyle conformity." "Is this legal?" "Completely legal," she said. "Mixed-use commercial properties can include residential units. We have proper permits. We meet safety and building code requirements. We carry appropriate insurance. The only unusual thing is that we're organized around night shift schedules instead of day shift schedules." "How many communities like this are there?" "More than you'd think," she said. "Night shift workers are about 12% of the workforce, but traditional housing serves maybe 2% of their actual needs. There's a substantial market for alternative residential arrangements." Margaret showed me floor plans and lease agreements for different types of residential units in the building. Studio apartments, one-bedroom units, shared housing arrangements, even some family units for night shift workers with children whose schedules allowed for non-traditional family arrangements. The rents were significantly lower than comparable day shift housing in the area, partly because the building had lower property values as a former commercial space, but mostly because night shift housing had less market demand and therefore lower market prices. "What about the security job?" I asked. "How does that fit into the community?" "Security guards serve two functions," she said. "Building security, which is what you were hired for, and community liaison, which is what you become if you stay longer than a few months." "Community liaison?" "Someone who understands both the security requirements and the community operations. Someone who can handle day shift property management questions without compromising night shift community privacy. Someone who can handle community issues without compromising building security. Margaret explained that most security guards lasted only a few weeks because they couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of discovering that their job wasn't what they thought it was. But the ones who adapted to the reality of night shift community life often became long-term employees who provided valuable stability to both the security operations and the community operations. Are you interested in that kind of work? I thought about my situation. Studio apartment above a laundromat, divorce debt, limited employment options, social isolation. The night shift community offered better housing, steady work, and social connections that actually fit my current schedule. What would that involve? Continuing your current security responsibilities, she said, but also learning about community management, residential lease administration, commercial tenant relations, and conflict resolution. Basically, becoming the person who handles the intersection between building operations and community operations. The position would include housing in the residential level, at about half what I was paying for my current apartment. It would include access to all the commercial services in the building, which would solve most of my shopping and dining challenges. And it would include integration into a community of people who understood the challenges of working unconventional hours. There's one thing you should know, Margaret said. Once you become part of the night shift community, it's difficult to go back to day shift living. Your social connections, your commercial relationships, your housing situation, all of it becomes oriented around night shift schedules. Most people who make this transition don't reverse it. Is that a problem? Only if you think of it as limiting your options, she said. Some people think of it as finding options that actually work for their lives. I told Margaret I needed to think about it, but I was already leaning towards saying yes. The night shift community offered solutions to problems I'd been struggling with for months. The work was interesting, the housing was affordable, and the community seemed genuinely supportive of its members. Take your time, she said, but don't take too long. We've had 4 security guards quit in the past 3 months. We need someone who's going to stay. Over the next week, I found myself spending more time in the residential level during my breaks. I talked to other community members, learned about their work and their reasons for choosing night shift living. I met a nurse who worked overnight shifts at 2 different hospitals, a freelance graphic designer who preferred working while the rest of the world slept, a truck driver who handled long-distance routes that required sleeping during the day, a software developer who did contract work for companies in different time zones. All of them had stories about struggling with traditional housing before finding the night shift community. Complaints from neighbors, problems with lease requirements, difficulty accessing services during their available hours, social isolation from living on schedules that didn't match anyone else's. It's not for everyone, the nurse told me. But for people who actually work nights, it's better than anything available in traditional housing. I also started shopping in the night shift retail stores, getting to know the businesses that serve the community. Meridian Books specialized in technical manuals, professional references, and educational materials for people who were studying or training during unconventional hours. Timeless Gifts carried household items, personal care products, and practical goods that weren't available in traditional late-night retail. Northbound Travel helped people with unusual work schedules plan vacations and personal travel that worked around non-standard availability. The businesses weren't just serving night shift workers. They were operated by night shift workers, people who understood the specific needs and challenges of living and working outside traditional schedules. After 2 weeks of regular interaction with the community, I decided to accept Margaret's offer. The transition was easier than I'd expected. My new residential unit was larger and more comfortable than my previous apartment and significantly less expensive. The building management handled utilities, maintenance, and security as part of the lease arrangement, which simplified my monthly expenses considerably. More importantly, I was no longer socially isolated. I had neighbors who understood my schedule, commercial services that operated during my available hours, and community activities that happened during times when I was naturally awake and alert. The expanded security responsibilities were also more interesting than basic building security. I learned about commercial lease management, residential tenant relations, conflict resolution between different types of community members, and coordination with day-shift property management operations. Most challenging was learning to manage the boundary between the night shift community and external day shift society. Property management companies, government inspectors, delivery services, and various business contacts all operated on day shift schedules and expectations. Part of my job was translating between night shift community operations and day shift administrative requirements without compromising the privacy and autonomy that made the night shift community successful. 6 months into my expanded role, I realized how much my understanding of work and community had changed. I'd gone from thinking of my job as temporary income while I figured out my next move, to thinking of my job as part of a community that actually provided what I needed for long-term stability and satisfaction. If you're interested in stories about communities that exist outside conventional society, hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happened when day shift management discovered our night shift operations. The challenge came in my 8th month, when the property development company decided to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of the building's commercial potential. Margaret called an emergency community meeting at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. About 40 residents gathered in the main common area of the residential level, along with several of the business owners from the retail level. Corporate headquarters wants to do a complete assessment of the building, Margaret said. Revenue analysis, market potential, development options. They're sending a team next week to evaluate whether the property should be redeveloped, sold, or demolished. The evaluation would include interviews with tenants, inspection of all lease spaces, review of all lease agreements, and analysis of the building's financial performance. Everything the night shift community had been designed to keep separate from traditional day shift business operations would be exposed to traditional day shift business analysis. What does that mean for the community? Someone asked. Depends on what the evaluation concludes, Margaret said. Best case scenario, they determined that night shift operations are profitable enough to leave alone. Worst case scenario, they decide that traditional day shift retail or residential development would be more profitable, and they terminate all existing leases. Can they do that? They can choose not to renew leases when current terms expire, Margaret said. Most of our leases are short-term, specifically to give the property company flexibility while the building's future was uncertain. That flexibility works against us if they decide to change the building's use. Margaret explained that the evaluation team would be conducting their assessment during day shift hours, which meant they'd be evaluating a building that would appear completely empty and unused during their visit. Night shift operations that were profitable and well-organized would be invisible to day shift evaluation. We need someone to interface with the evaluation team, Margaret said. Someone who understands both the night shift operations and day shift business language. Someone who can represent the community's interests without compromising the community's privacy. Everyone looked at me. I'd been handling day shift property management coordination for several months, so I was the obvious choice for handling the evaluation team coordination. But representing the night shift community to corporate evaluation was more complex than handling routine administrative questions. What would that involve? I asked. Making the case that night shift operations are profitable, sustainable, and valuable, Margaret said. without revealing operational details that could be used to replicate the model in ways that would destroy what makes it successful. This was the fundamental challenge of night shift community success. It worked specifically because it operated outside traditional business models. But defending it from traditional business analysis required explaining its value in traditional business language. I spent the next week preparing for the evaluation team's visit. I compiled revenue data from the retail operations, occupancy rates from the residential operations, maintenance cost data, and comparative analysis of the building's current profitability versus its costs when it was completely empty. The numbers were impressive. Night shift operations were generating about 60% of the revenue the building had produced during peak day shift operations, but with about 30% of the operational costs. Profit margins were higher, tenant retention was better, and maintenance issues were fewer. The evaluation team arrived on a Wednesday morning and spent 3 days reviewing the property. 2 corporate analysts, 1 property development specialist, and 1 financial consultant. All of them operating on day shift schedules. All of them evaluating a building that appeared empty during their working hours. My job was to provide context for what they were seeing without revealing operational details that could compromise the community's autonomy. The building appears to be significantly underutilized, the lead analyst said during our first meeting. Current operations generate substantial revenue per square foot, I replied. Higher profit margins than traditional retail operations. But the occupancy appears minimal. Occupancy rates are excellent during operational hours, I said. The businesses and residents operate on schedules that differ from standard commercial hours. I walked them through the financial data, emphasizing profitability, tenant retention, and operational efficiency. I explained that night shift operations require different evaluation metrics than day shift operations, but that those metrics demonstrated strong business performance. What type of businesses are operating here? The property development specialist asked. Specialty retail, professional services, and residential leases, I said. Serving markets that aren't well served by traditional commercial operations. Can you be more specific? This was the challenge. Being specific enough to demonstrate value, but not so specific that corporate headquarters could understand exactly how night shift operations worked. Businesses serving customers with non-traditional schedules, I said. Medical personnel, security workers, transportation workers, people in 24-hour service industries. Markets with steady demand but limited commercial options. And the residential component? Alternative housing arrangements for people whose work schedules make traditional housing difficult, I said. High occupancy, low maintenance, stable rental income. The evaluation team spent considerable time trying to understand why the building was profitable with what appeared to be minimal activity. I provided enough information to demonstrate financial success without providing enough information for them to replicate or modify the operations in ways that would destroy their effectiveness. On Friday afternoon, the evaluation team completed their assessment. The lead analyst called me into Margaret's office for a final interview. Your building operations are unusual, he said, but the financial performance is strong. Revenue per square foot is competitive, operational costs are low, and tenant retention is excellent. The operations are designed around market needs that aren't served by traditional commercial real estate, I said. We're recommending that current operations be maintained, he said, with some modifications. What kind of modifications? Expanded marketing to increase occupancy, standardized lease terms for better administrative efficiency, and integration with day shift property management systems for better oversight. Everything he was describing would destroy the night shift community's effectiveness. Expanded marketing would attract attention that would compromise the privacy that made night shift living successful. Standardized lease terms would eliminate the flexibility that allowed night shift workers to find housing that actually fit their needs. Integration with day shift property management would subject night shift operations to day shift administrative requirements that didn't match night shift operational realities. Those modifications might compromise the operational effectiveness that generates the current financial success, I said. Why? The current success is based on serving markets that specifically need alternatives to traditional commercial and residential arrangements, I said. Modifications that make operations more traditional would eliminate the market advantages that generate current profitability. The analyst looked skeptical. Market alternatives that can't be scaled or standardized aren't sustainable business models. Market alternatives that lose their effectiveness when they're scaled or standardized aren't sustainable business models, I corrected. But market alternatives that maintain their effectiveness within appropriate operational parameters can be sustainable indefinitely. What would you recommend? Maintain current operations without modifications, I said. Monitor financial performance, but don't change operational parameters that are generating successful results. The evaluation team left that afternoon. Margaret said their final report would be submitted to corporate headquarters within 2 weeks, and the property company would make decisions about the building's future within a month after that. While we waited, life in the night shift community continued normally. People worked their shifts, shopped in the retail stores, handled their personal business, participated in community activities. But there was an underlying tension, knowing that our entire way of life was being evaluated by people who fundamentally didn't understand how it worked. 3 weeks later, Margaret received the decision. Current operations would be maintained for an additional 2 years, with a comprehensive review at the end of that period. No operational modifications would be required, but the property company reserved the right to change lease terms if financial performance declined. It was the best outcome we could have hoped for. The night shift community would continue operating, but with the knowledge that its future was always subject to reevaluation by people who measured success using metrics that didn't necessarily capture what made the community successful. 2 years, Margaret said during the community meeting where she announced the decision. Time to prove that what we've built here can be sustained long-term. And if we can't prove it, then we'll need to find other places to build it, she said. But we'll know how to build it better next time. I realized that my role in the community had evolved beyond security and property management. I'd become someone who understood how to translate between night shift community values and day shift business requirements. Someone who could help protect alternative communities from evaluation systems that weren't designed to recognize their value. 6 months later, I was offered a position working with other night shift communities in different cities, helping them navigate property management challenges and corporate evaluations. I turned it down. The divorce papers are finally paid off, and I have a savings account that shows a balance I'm proud of. But more than that, I found something I didn't know I was looking for when I signed that contract in the Denny's parking lot. The night shift community isn't just where I work anymore. It's where I belong. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed the rules exactly as Mike explained them. If I'd stayed in the security office, avoided the occupied stores, never discovered the residential level. But I think about the woman in the food court who told me most guards either freak out and quit, or they start trying to shut everything down. I didn't either. I'm still here, and I still don't sleep the way I used to.